Welcome, everyone. We're really pleased that you've been able to join us for this very exciting roundtable. It's particularly of interest to us in American religion and the study of Islam and Africana religions. I want to welcome you on behalf of my colleague Cooper Harris. Together, we edit the journal American Religion, and we're hosting this through IU's Center for Religion and the Human, which is a wonderful new center thinking big ideas about religion. So tonight's webinar will be in 3 parts. First, we'll hear a little bit from each panelist. Then we'll have a little time for our panelists to be in conversation with one another. And then finally, we'll be able to take your questions. As you go, you should find on the bottom of your Zoom bar a little thing that says Q&A. And if you click on that, you can put your questions in there. We'll be taking our questions from there when we get to the Q&A portion. You can feel free to put them in as you think of them, as they come to you, but do know that we won't be getting to them until that 3rd portion of the evening. So I'd also like to begin with a big thank you to Professor Kayla Wheeler, who is one of our panelists tonight. We wouldn't be here without her. She initially put together a written version of this same scholarly question, and you can see that in the next issue of our journal. We also wanted to give her a chance to be a panelist and take off her organizing hat for an evening. So big thanks to her, and I'll introduce her in a minute. So in order, our panelists will be speaking relatively briefly because we really do want this to be a conversation and a chance for us to get to hear them together. Our first panelist will be Zaid Adhami at Williams College. Our second panelist will be Professor Edward E. Curtis, the 4th, at Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis, which we call IUPUI. So I sort of tripped over all of the words when I had to say them individually. Then Professor Shrina Gandhi, who's at Michigan State University. And then Professor Kayla Renee Wheeler, who's at Xavier University. So I will get out of your way so we can begin. Professor Adhami.
Thank you so much. I was about to start talking without unmuting, but still not used to all of this. Thank you so much, Dr. Imhoff, Sarah, and Cooper Harris for allowing this, hosting us, facilitating this conversation, and also Dr. Wheeler for initiating it in the first place and getting in and including me. Reaching out to me and including me in this conversation was a big honor, and very excited about the issue that's about to come out and this conversation. So when I was approached to think about this question of, is Islam American religion? Why is it or not? Kind of approached in that way. I kind of approached it from an angle of thinking about the question of Muslim belonging and inclusion in the US. And that's kind of what was on my mind, is thinking about the way in which, to the extent that it's often not included as American religion or not taken seriously, or a case is made that we should think of Islam and Muslims as, part of American religion, it often, the question seems to revolve around the axis of whether Muslims are considered legitimately a part of the nation. Are they, have they actually been kind of included or represented, or themselves kind of taken an active part and been incorporated into Americanness, into the country. And so I kind of approached my thinking about this from that angle. And what I wanted to show was, for one, I highlight the way in which, Muslims have, for quite a long time been excluded from national belonging in many ways. And this is a pretty common story that many of us know. But I also wanted to think about many Muslim communities' own active attempts to separate themselves from broader US society, or instead to identify themselves with global Muslim, racial, ethnic, national collectivities to which they could belong, either apart from or parallel to the nation. And I wanted to think about that, and in the face of that, how to think of Islam as an American religion when considering that kind of both, marginalization, but also self-separation in some ways. And so in answering the question of whether Islam is an American religion, I counterintuitively try to identify this exclusion and outsider stance as a deeply American expression of Islam and Muslimness. So in order to show that, what I do in the essay is I, structure a narrative of some, significant shifts, and it's of course a very simplified story because it's a 1,500 or 2,000 word essay, and this could be several books. But I just try to create a brief narrative of how some Muslims have conceived of their place in the US and how those shifts are tied to evolving constructions of Americanness and national belonging, and specifically the relationship to the categories of religion and race. And so in the first part, I described the ways in which many Muslim communities throughout the 20th century constructed their identities as internal outsiders to American national identity. And they sought to identify with global Muslim collectivities to which they could belong as a mode of counter citizenship, or an alternative imagined community. And so that doesn't mean that they necessarily rejected citizenship or political participation in the US, but at the very least, for many groups, there was a very ambivalent or conflicted sense of belonging to Americanness. And they sought out parallel modes of belonging beyond the nation. And what I discussed in the essay, and what I wanted to think about, was the ways in which this was deeply tied to hegemonic constructions of collective political and civilizational identity, and hegemonic constructions of race and religion in America, what America was conceived as in terms of whiteness and Christianity, that then led to a rise of a certain kind of way of trying to seek out parallel modes of identification. And so Muslimness was tied to a kind of collective political civilizational identity in many cases. And in this construal of identity, it's interesting because religion and political belonging were really inextricably bound together and not easily separable categories. And so that's kind of how I'm situating that in the kind of 20th century. And then the second half, I sketch a number of key shifts that take place in towards the the latter half of the 20th century into the 21st century. And what I argue is that this kind of stance of ambivalence and refusal towards complete American belonging has in many ways disappeared within US Muslims' own prominent discourses and institutions. And Muslims in the US now much more kind of strongly conceive of themselves as constituting a genuinely American religious community, rather than as internal outsiders whose true sense of belonging is to a kind of global Muslim racial national collectivity. So, and so this, and this has a lot of manifestations, a lot of different implications of how Muslims see themselves and relate to each other. And so, and I tie this to shifts in conceptions of nation, race, religion, et cetera, but also to the rise of, the construction of the Muslim other, which is kind of paradoxical in its own ways. But basically, just to make sure that I'm not going over time, because I don't know how much time I've taken yet, I just want to kind of capture the three kind of essential takeaways that I think that I wanted to raise with this kind of narrative. And one is that methodologically speaking, I think the question, like I kind of began, the question of Americanness, the Americanness of Islam or lack of, I don't think should be approached primarily through the question of how Muslims have been legitimately incorporated and included or represented or claim belonging, et cetera, or not in the US. Because what I'm arguing is that both their inclusion and belonging, or their refusal of it, or their exclusion from it, are all products of hegemonic constructions of race and nation and religion in the US. And so they're participating in those constructions, being formed by them, responding to them, navigating them. And so what I think, for me, what's important, and at least in my work, is to kind of examine the ways that various discursive constructs and socio-political conditions in the US produce the various forms of American Islam that we study. And in this case, I was specifically looking at this kind of understanding of nation, and the way that religion is constructed, both as, fundamentally a matter of personal conscience in the way that we often talk about, but then there's another kind of overlooked dimension in which religion is really tied to nationhood, civilization, whiteness, etc., in terms of, how Christianity has been constructed in the US. And so the last thing that I wanted to just mention was, and this is kind of implicit and unspoken in the piece itself, but that the narrative that I'm telling doesn't really convey a celebratory attitude towards this kind of full political belonging and identification with the US, which I describe as kind of the predominant attitude that has arisen in the 21st century. And, I think the tone that comes across is that it's not an unambiguously good thing necessarily to see, oh, okay, now American Muslims have arrived, now they're fully American. And that's what our normative goal is in this literature, is describing how can Muslims be fully American in that sense. Because, I describe it, for instance, as a process where Islam and Muslims could become incorporated into a liberal vision of the nation on the condition that they disavow any claims of belonging or identification with global transnational Muslim collectivities in the context of, for instance, the War on Terror era. So it's not necessarily a triumphant or progressive development, but one for many that's a loss of certain global collectivist ethos. And both that ethos and its loss are in many ways tied to these kinds of power relations and hegemonic exclusions. So, and, for instance, in my own ethnographic work, this is something that, a number of interlocutors or other intellectual interlocutors outside of my fieldwork have talked about as something they've very much identified and experienced as a loss in their own lifetimes, is this loss of this sense of like globalness that Muslim Americans might have had before, and thinking about what gives rise to that is some of what led me to kind of frame my response to these questions in the way I have. I hope I didn't go over. I'm not sure.
That was terrific. Thank you so much, Professor.
Okay, thank you.
It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Curtis.
Thank you so much, Dr. Imhoff. Thank you, Dr. Harris. Thanks to Dr. Wheeler for the invitation to participate in this roundtable in the journal. I want to use my time to tell you a story. And I want to tell you the story of Joe Hassan Shami, who was born in 1887 in Syria and arrived in South Dakota in 1903. And like every other Syrian immigrant, practically, he registered for the military draft as the United States prepared to enter World War I. He declared his intention to become a U.S. citizen, and a 1918 change in U.S. law meant that by serving in the military, his wish would be granted. And on July 2nd, Shami was made a citizen at Camp Merritt in Bergen, New Jersey. On July 6th, just 4 days later, Private Shami shipped out on the Scodian from New York as part of Company I, 361st Infantry, 91st Division of the American Expeditionary Forces. According to the Red Cross, Private Shami was wounded in battle on September 29th, just 3 days before the 91st Division had begun its assault on the German army as part of the Meuse-Argonne offensive. The 361st Infantry, like other units, was charged with trying to take German trenches. The problem was that in order to do so, soldiers had to traverse several hundred yards of mud, debris, shell holes, tanglefoot, and concertina wire as they charged German machine gun nests. Private Shami, while doing this, was hit in the leg. He received care at an American hospital, but it may have taken some time before he received medical attention. Because of a German artillery barrage, it was impossible to evacuate all of the wounded until September 30th. Joe Hassan Shami did not recover. According to his grave marker, he died on October 17th, 1918. He was buried with full military honors, wrote Genevieve Swayze, a Red Cross casualty searcher. The coffin was covered with the American flag, and flowers were given by the American Red Cross to place on his grave. After the chaplain had read the prayers, the firing squad fired 3 volleys, and the bugler sounded the final taps, while all the soldiers present stood at salute. His burial place today and then is the Meuse-Argonne American Cemetery, located near Romagny-sur-Montfaucon in France. The spot seems an ideal one for our American boys, wrote Genevieve Swayze, who have fought so bravely in this world war for democracy. He was laid to rest with others who also had made the supreme sacrifice. Such memorialization placed a Syrian Muslim at the heart of the American story, interpreting the spilling of his blood as a sacrifice that made the life of our nation possible. Even as his body was laid to rest in foreign soil, his memory was repatriated in his new nation. Public recognition of this Syrian Muslim sacrifice for America was not seen in Sioux Falls, South Dakota as the act of an outsider. As Genevieve Swayze put it, Joe Shammy was one of, quote unquote, our boys. Except for one thing. As the dead were buried, all service members except for Jews received a Christian cross as their grave marker. The US Army did not allow service members to identify as Muslim. To this day, Joe Shammy's body is buried underneath a cross. But Joe Shammy was a Muslim. He grew up in a Muslim family. His next of kin was either living with or was one of the most prominent Muslims in Sioux Falls. And in 1915, he told the South Dakota census taker that he was, quote unquote, a Mohammedan. No one passing by his grave today would know that. The fact that Joe Shammy's body lies under this Christian symbol erases his Muslim identity from the archive of American religious studies. How many others are buried, mislabeled, ignored in graves and archives, and most importantly of all, in our own memories? Why do we, the people, go along with this erasure of who we have been? Challenging the white Christian supremacy of the field of religious studies has never been more important or timely. Much of our shared religious past, like that of Joe Hassan Shammy, is yet to be unearthed.
Thank you so much, Dr. Curtis. Our next speaker, Dr. Gandhi, will begin.
Sorry, I totally forgot to unmute, and I will start timing myself now. So I want to thank everyone as well for organizing this, and especially to my friend Kayla, who asked me to write on this. And at first I was like, well, I'm not an Islamicist. I am trained in American religious history, religion in the Americas. But as I started thinking more about what she challenged me to think about is the very structures of my field don't allow necessarily for Islam to be fully integrated into the narrative. So I'm going to start with a quote from Malcolm X, which I was going to put in my original paper, but took out because it's a really long quote. But I feel like it gives me a direction in terms of how to think about not only the United States as a cultural space, as a national space, but also my field. So this is what he says in May 1963 in an interview to Playboy magazine. He says, between the racists and integrationists, I highly prefer the racists. I'd rather walk among rattlesnakes whose constant rattle warns me where they are among those northern snakes who grin and make you forget you're still in the snake pit. The entire economy is based on white supremacy. Even the religious philosophy is, in essence, white supremacy. A white Jesus, a white virgin, white angels, white everything, but a black devil. Of course, the Uncle Sam Political Foundation is based on white supremacy. It goes without saying that the social philosophy is strictly white supremacist, and the educational system that perpetuates white supremacy. The fact that I prefer the candor of the Southern segregationist to the hypocrisy of the Northern integrationist doesn't alter the basic immorality of white supremacy. The devil is a devil whether he wears a bedsheet or a Brooks Brothers suit. And I think he kind of hits the nail on the head in terms of describing what it feels like sometimes as a person of color to deal with white America and a very white subfield. And I would just want to point out, especially, this Malcolm X is a Black man who experienced white racial terror throughout his entire life and is a Muslim as well. And so I feel like he kind of fits this entire panel, and this quote is, every time I read it, it gives me life. So I'm just gonna say what gets in the way of, I think, American religious historians really centering Islam, or at least attempting to center Islam as an American religion, are several myths that hold up the fallacy of white supremacy, right? The basic being the idea that white people are superior to all others, and in particular defined as the literal opposite of Black people. The myths of white supremacy imbue American culture, religious studies, and thus the subfield of American religious history in deep and ingrained ways, such that research and pedagogy are generationally and cyclically impacted. Past calls to diversify and current calls for decolonization were and are meaningless unless the very frame of how we teach religion in America is changed. And if we do not start with white supremacy culture and end with it, so you start by defining it, you end with the current rises in Islamophobia, Black Lives Matter, land back, etc., I kind of think you're doing it wrong and incorrectly. So I'm going to make that kind of bold statement, and people can feel free to disagree with me, but I think the last few years have shown that those of us who have been talking about white supremacy and anti-racism for years are unfortunately right? So in particular, in my field of American religious history, I think there are two myths that shape our field, and that is this idea of religious freedom and the idea of religious diversity. These myths are woven into the fabric of how Americans understand themselves, and they are reified through our K through 12 education, through our celebration of national holidays, and in American religious history classrooms. We have countless edited volumes and textbooks that allow us to celebrate that persecuted Protestants were able to make their escape from the ignorance of Europe and practice in the colonies how they saw fit. And we have even more edited volumes that display American religious diversity with at least one essay about 2 to 3 of non-Christian religious communities or non-white Christian communities. These teaching aids allow us to perpetuate the myth of American religious freedom while showcasing American religious diversity. At the same time, they more insidiously cover up that religious freedom has never been for all, and religious diversity is only valued when convenient and, quite frankly, to be honest, Protestant or Christian in general. So I'm just going to end there, and I look forward to the conversation, and thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Professor Conde. And last we have Professor Wheeler.
Great. So I just want to thank Dr. Christian Peterson, who was the inspiration for the roundtable and for this panel. He tweeted a thread back in February that asked many of these questions that we're trying to answer here today. So I wanted to point out to all of the viewers something. There are no white speakers on this panel. There are no Arab men are not the majority of this panel. There are an equal number of men and women, and there are people at all ranks in the academy within this panel. And on the roundtable, we also have a graduate student who was not able to attend here today. So this is something that's very, very rare when you think about religious studies, especially Islamic studies. And I wanted to make that clear that it is possible to have panels like this. People choose to not do that. It's an active choice they make. So when we say Islam in America, we need to ask, who are we including? And that means both in terms of research subjects and scholars. So while the field of American religion has made more room for the study of Islam, what I argue and my contribution to the roundtable is that they haven't made room for the full diversity of Muslims in the United States, and that American religion as a subfield has played a central role in valorizing what I call hegemonic Islam. And it's this privileging of Arab Islam, and I put that in air quotes because it's not a real thing, but Arab Islam as the most authentic version of Islam, while marginalizing Black and Africana versions of Islam. And so I break down hegemonic Islam into three things as the result of three things. First, it's Muslims' own embrace of the Islamic East as the site of authentic Islam. So looking to the Saudi Arabia, Middle East, looking to Southeast Asia and South Asia as a place where real Islam exists and everything else is being less than authentic. The second result of hegemonic Islam in academia has to do with religious studies scholars themselves, especially non-Islamic studies specialists who play a key role in creating positions and writing job advertisements for Islamic studies positions, as well as Islam in America positions. And Elise Morgenstein First has an article coming out in the Journal of the American Academy of Religion, where she actually goes through a number of job advertisements, and she shows how scholars who do not specialize in Islam have played a major role in constructing normative Islam that's usually centered around Arabic fluency, research that focuses on the Middle East, and the ability to teach the Quran and Islamic law. And so through doing this, Islam is positioned as a foreign brown religion, and Muslims are viewed as the religious other. Now, that emphasis on textualism, so focusing on the Quran and Islamic law, that hints at the lasting influences of white Protestantism in American religion. And the general focus on Arabic and the Middle East, it marginalized many Black Muslims, especially Black American Muslims, who cannot always trace their natal history outside of the United States. And so finally, I argue the rise of hegemonic Islam and this embrace within academia is a result of viewing Black Muslims through a lens of protest, so obscuring the rich theological diversity among Black Muslims. And we can see this most readily when we talk about how the Nation of Islam has been described since its founding in the 1930s. So early academics and much of the early media coverage of the nation sought to position it as an inauthentic political organization rather than a religious one. And you go all the way back to see Eric Lincoln coining the term Black Muslims in his book, The Black Muslims in America. And that was a name that stuck. And it did not have good meanings to it at all. It was to position them as not real, those people over there who have this race going on. But it's something that Black Muslims, Muslims of African descent, have appropriated and reclaimed over time as a part of their unique religio-racial identity, to quote African-American religious historian Judith Weisenfeld. So the structuring of Islam within American religion has had a horrible effect on my own academic career, and it's been one of the major roadblocks for me in my trajectory. So I'm trained in Islamic studies, but I study Black Muslims in the United States, Black Muslim women's lived experiences. The job market is trash no matter who you are, and it's not about your merit or your intelligence, it's about fit, and usually being a white man. So despite applying to over 100 jobs, I've never once been invited for a campus interview for an Islamic studies position. And I can name to you multiple people who do not have degrees in Islamic studies, but study Near Eastern studies, study Arabic, who are given jobs within Islamic studies and religious studies because of this narrow view of what Islam is, especially in an American context. So for me, I don't think it's necessarily a question, is Islam an American religion? Does it need to be included in the subfield? It's why do we want it to be? If we know the history of American religions and its connection to colonialism and white supremacy and sexism and the relationship to American Protestantism, why would we want to be included in such a field? So firmly situating ourselves within a field that's rooted in all of this oppression isn't going to actually change anything whatsoever in the field. It's just going to put usually more white people talking about the mysterious brown other. So for me, the goal isn't to see how we can fit into American religion. It's what other conversation partners can we find who are interested in answering similar types of questions, who are engaged in similar methodologies and theories. And I argue in my contribution that we should center our conversations with Black religion scholars, anthropologists, people who do Islamic studies but work outside of the field because they're not bound by the same white Christian gaze that makes us focus so much on explaining Islam and Muslims through a Christian lens, where we can just let all of that go and freely build worlds that are much more liberatory than what we have today. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wheeler. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Cooper Harris, for this next part, facilitating the conversation amongst our panelists.
Here I am. Welcome everyone, and many thanks to the panel. I think the way that we wanted to work this first, I know we have questions coming in. I see another one has just come in. Those of you who are watching at home can submit questions through the Q&A function, but I think we wanted to begin in the beginning by just allowing our panelists to have conversations among themselves. So I will sort of trust in the genius of the collective and kind of open it up. Are there places where you all would like to go, or points of friction or concord that you think might be useful to elaborate on?
Yeah, so I just have a question for Dr. Curtis, since you're one of the OGs. How have you seen a change across time in terms of the relationship between American religion and the study of Islam in America?
Yeah, well, my answer would necessarily be anecdotal, but it seems to me that I got my first regular tenure track job in the year 2000, and one of the things that's really happened is after 9/11, the number of positions in Islamic studies increased so dramatically that there was, for a while, so I mean, and this is your story might have been different if you were as old as I am, because they literally 1 year at AAR, at the American Academy of Religion, at the major hiring festival for the field of religious studies, they literally had too few Islamic studies scholars for too many jobs. And what happened during these years right after post 9/11, as new lines were created, sort of reminiscent of the way that Sovietology after World War II really expanded the academy, and Russian language and literature and such, is, first of all, is that many textualists were hired into these positions. You didn't have to be a trained Islamic studies scholar. As long as you could read the Quran and the Hadith, or the reports of the sayings and deeds of the Prophet Muhammad, you were good to go. I mean, you could be from a variety of different, and then the other thing was, there actually was, as some departments had more than Islamic studies positions, they then opened up a second position, oftentimes either in something that wasn't text, Islam and women, or Islam in America. And that's how I got to UNC Chapel Hill. I was, there was only one Islamicist there. And then, 9/11 happened, then they created another position. And so this kind of expansion did create opportunities for those of us already in the job market. The problem, it was interesting. The problem was, at least again, anecdotally, my experience has been, my work has overall, I'm working now on my 12th book, and Joe Hassan Shami's story will be in that book. But I would say, I don't know for sure, but it seems to me that in terms of my publication, the prestigious places where I got to publish and such, oftentimes Americanists were far more happy to have me in their, the Journal of American History, Religion and American Culture, American Quarterly. These are all very prestigious journals. I've not been in IJMIS, the International Journal of the Middle East Studies, for example. So Islam in America, Islam was in many ways more central to American religious studies, at least in my career, than it was to Islamic studies, where for me, it remains a sideshow because of the dramatic expansion of those people centering the Quran and the Hadith, sometimes Sufism, but especially the sacred text as the core of what it means to be Muslim, which simply reiterates, Dr. Wheeler, exactly what you've just said.
And then even what is considered a sacred text. So focusing on the Quran, if you're talking about American religions and American Islam, how many of these Islamicists can teach Circle 7? So, which is one of the books from the Moorish Science Temple of America.
Thank you both for your reflections. And I mean, just to reiterate what both of you said, I mean, I think it's very telling the way that the kind of implicit assumptions about what real Islam is, ends up, also playing into this dynamic that I was thinking about before the event as well, that it's not just is Islam American religion, but also something I've very much seen in the field as well is can American Islam and American Muslims and American Muslim history be part of Islamic studies? And that is also very much usually a no. So I appreciated that point. But I wanted to go, just something that Dr. Wheeler, you mentioned about, this construct of hegemonic Islam and Arab Islam that I think is very important. And it just resonated with something I was thinking about before the event about, what directions the field is going in and things that have been helpful, but, other kinds of gaps. And I've just, there's certainly this very prominent theme in the historiography of Islam in the US about the centrality of revivalism and the global Islamic revival movement, informing US Muslim institutions and stuff since, the 60s onwards. But there's very much this, I mean, what you're calling hegemonic Islam and Arab Islam, I would very much also identify with a kind of revivalist, hegemony that is tied with kind of racial implications as well. But there's a way in which that's always been acknowledged, and yet to me it always feels like it's not properly accounted for, and that there's still something lacking in much of the discussions around being able to really account for that power of what is so intuitively, authoritatively Islamic, being tied to the production over the course of the 20th century of this revivalist kind of orientation towards Islam that just takes this kind of, it just has such a facticity to it that this is ultimately what Islam is this kind of relationship to sacred text. And so I was just wondering if you or anybody else had more thoughts on this, of what, whether you feel a similar kind of gap, or whether there's a way we can turn our attention to a kind of reflexive attention to this revivalism, the hegemony of this kind of revivalist conceptions of what Islam and religion really are, that end up, ultimately that is what Islam is, and anything else is just an exception. Semi-question. I don't know if anybody has thoughts on that.
I mean, it's something I noticed. I haven't come up with an easy way to talk about it. So the one way I talk about it is through my work on fashion. and how you see just over time in different countries, indigenous dress practices being replaced by the abaya or niqab, where it was not seen before, especially in like Southeast Asia and in certain Black American communities here, because that is what real Islam is. This like pan-Islamic identity. We need to reject all the bad stuff from our culture and do what the Arabs are doing because they're good. But I think for me, it's something that I want to get away from is we focus so much on that like top-down approach where like those people are over there are influencing. But there, especially with Black Muslims, there's so many moments of collaboration and communication that happens before the 1960s. And you talk about the Ahmadiyas, but you can also talk about Arab Muslims who came here after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and were looking through phone books, looking for anybody who had like an Arabic sounding name and seeing all these people in the nation or in Moorish science or in Sunni Muslim communities who are Black and like connecting with them and finding a space to collaborate, maybe have debates around theology or practice. But I think we spend so much time talking about the tension that we don't leave that much room for collaboration and messy collaboration at that.
Yeah, I just wanted to just add briefly to that, I mean, I think that's a really important point. And one, I was thinking on this question of American religion as a category. I mean, one of the risks, I think, is to kind of parochialize and not kind of like if what we're trying to account for is the certain discourses and practices and communities, et cetera, to kind of like not take a transnational global kind of understanding of how these interactions happened in very dynamic ways, like you're saying, is important. And so I appreciate when you were saying this thing in your beginning remarks around why should we, like, is the goal to be included in American religion, or also be, is it more fruitful to be in conversation with other kinds of fields, is an interesting one. Yeah.
Yeah, I actually made this point in the piece that will appear in American Religions, which is, is that, and one of the exciting things about the journal called American Religions is that it's defining American in a pan-hemispheric way, even though most of the content is about North America. But I think, Sarah and Cooper, it's fair to say you have this vision, you have this desideratum, that you want that it really is the Americas. I mean, and it has to be. I mean, you can't understand the history of just the lower, 48 states, right, without understanding the history of Mexico, for example, and the many native nations that still exist today and whose land is being occupied by the United States. And so, I mean, really, it's not a matter of being politically correct. It's not a matter of being tolerant. It's a matter of being factual and excellent and having powerful analysis of what is and has been American religion. And American religion has never been neatly contained by the US nation state. The US nation state is a powerful shaper of identity, of practices, of all these. But that doesn't mean that the people who happen to live within the borders of the United States, actually all don't fight against it, accept part of it, resist other parts of it. And so there is absolutely one of the ways to include Islam and to produce a better picture of American religion is to have a hemispheric a vision on American religion, because then we will understand how Africana Islam and other Africana-based religious practices circulated not only in the Americas, but also across the Black Atlantic, back and forth, call and response, as Paul Gilroy used to said so beautifully in the Black Atlantic. And a call and response of religion. And this is one of the great impediments, is that we need to resist, we need to push our colleagues in American religions to never use the nation state as an unquestioned natural container for for whatever the phenomenon they're studying. It is so intellectually lazy. It is so easy to get away with. People say American, you can write, and somehow, even though the ideas, the objects, the movements have moved across the Americas, across the Pacific, across the Atlantic. Just take white revivalism. The Second Great Awakening was a transatlantic phenomenon, and the old white guys actually did write about that. But nowadays, it's as if you don't even need to study British history in order to. So I think, I do think it's really essential that we people who teach American religions, that we really resist. And we're gonna make people mad when we ask this question. Say, okay, well, when we bring up a datum, a fact, and say we show that what the phenomenon they're talking is actually transnational, transregional, or global.
So I have a question for Shrina. So one of our favorite writers together is Sierra Jones, and she has an article called Not Just the Syllabus, Throw the Whole Damn Discipline in the Trash. And my favorite quote from that is, destroy it all, not just the syllabus, the discipline. Your whole discipline needs to be dismantled and reimagined. And she's talking about theology and religious studies. So Shrina, what would dismantling religious studies and American religion look like? And how could we be reimagine it? For me, I love the idea of inserting ourselves into American religion and slapping around our colleagues, but I want us to destroy America and that idea as a whole. So until we can do that, what are the baby steps we can do to destroying it?
Right. So I think the baby steps are, I'm biased because I was trained in religion in the Americas, not in American religious history. So I'm biased to what Dr. Curtis is saying, which is, if you want to understand, if you want to understand anything in the lower 48, as he said, you have to understand what's going on in Canada, right? And right now in Canada, you have Indigenous populations whose land is being forcibly taken, built upon, and you have to understand what's going on our border and Mexico. Right now, the Kumeyaay people are protesting as we speak to stop the wall from being built and literally dissecting their ancestral homeland and their rightful homeland, right? And again, with Black Islam in the Americas, I think looking at what happened in the Caribbean, Brazil, the United States, Canada, across, especially I'm in Michigan, so Detroit, Windsor connection is so incredibly important. And we tend to, I think in some ways that our discipline, and I'm speaking for American religious historians, we're still kind of in that class of civilizations rhetoric, right? Where we tend to see, Western civilization or Anglo, I don't even know the stupid categories he used because he was so horrible, but he had such an impact, which makes me so angry, right? And, the Muslim world, and I think that's why you guys were talking about, there's a hegemonic form of Islam that tends to dominate scholarship and hires, that's steeped in Orientalism and the class of civilizations. And Orientalism, as we know, is very connected to white supremacy. So I think the small steps are, one, when we're training graduate students, we push to have more scholars of Latin America on dissertation committees and on exam committees so that they can hold their feet to the fire, right? Regarding a more international America's hemispheric perspective. I think the other thing, and I mentioned it in my piece, is we have to let go of these myths of religious diversity and of religious freedom, because as Sierra Jones said, it's harmful, right? When we say that, the United States is a place where anyone can practice whatever they practice, well, then you're leaving out Native Americans from that particular narrative, because their rituals, their religion was illegal until like 1973, right? So within our lifetime. And so, yeah, I mean, focusing on that and teaching our, like having our graduate students and us as we, go through the field, right? If we're still teaching the same thing that we were taught in graduate school or thinking the same thing that we're teaching in graduate school, we're doing something wrong as well, right? And so keeping up on that literature, and I think part of dismantling America means dismantling the ways in which white supremacy culture imbue our field and taking that out, rooting it out. And also, I think Kayla, Dr. Wheeler, my friend, what you said about hiring practices is so incredibly important. Who do we hire? Are we replicating ourselves, right? And this whole thing of fit, right? I think we need to just throw that out the door. Like if you're looking for fit, then you're going to keep hiring white scholars, right? And our curriculums are going to be the same and same and same again. So if you change your hiring practices to reorient them towards non-white scholars, then you're going to get different curriculums, you're going to get different classes, and this lack of a pipeline that we have in academia where we have a ton of white scholars but like zero indigenous scholars, that will end then, right? Because we'll actually, part of getting people into our field is getting them as undergraduates and saying like, this field is not just old white Puritans who are now Congregationalists, who many of our now Unitarian Universalists, like that's kind of boring. It's interesting, but it's boring. But I think, at least for students of color, and once you start talking and making syllabi and lectures that include them, they're gonna, enjoy our field a little bit more, become majors. I know that's a big thing in religious studies right now. We want majors. Well, how do you have majors is you stop teaching the same thing over and over again, and maybe you look to scholars of colors to, direct the field.
I'll say no shade though, at least in academia in the United States, non-white equals brown. So it very,
Yeah.
very rarely includes Black people.
Yes.
So I think Islamic studies has gotten better, not including the old white dudes who don't even speak Arabic, but it's just a whole bunch of Arab men and maybe a few South Asians here and there, and they're replicating the same oppressive systems as the white people because they know there are so few positions available and they want to keep their own. So if we're going to get more people, I think we have to center Black and Indigenous scholars.
For sure. And the other thing I would say is, as a South Asian, I have to think about the ways in which my community and my education replicates and is complicit with white supremacy, right? Replicates anti-Black racism, doesn't acknowledge that we're a settler state, and uphold that kind of Horatio Alger immigration myth that's celebratory, right? And yeah, so I'll stop there.
So thank you all for that. I want to make sure that we get to some of these really rich questions that are in the Q&A section. And I'll just remind those of you who are joining us along at home that you can submit your questions here. We'll try to get to as many of them as we can. We want to be mindful of time. We want to be able to deal with them deeply. The first one, and I think it's interesting, sort of asks, so it's clear that recognition of the willful absences, silences, racism in our traditional disciplines and in American Islam is crucial. But beyond that, and some of that I would hear, representation or sort of the larger conversation that's been going on. And I hope I'm not mischaracterizing the question, but the question is, which arguments, ideas, and thoughts do you find inspiring and promising for where you think we need to be going intellectually? So the questioner is asking, on the one hand, here's what's missing. And my interpretation of the question is, so what does sort of American Islam bring to Islamic studies and or American religion? And a number of you have mentioned this, but I think the questioner would like for you all maybe to lean in more to that question.
Well, so I would say, I think one thing that American Islam gives to both Islamic studies and American religions is a deeper analysis of the connection between race, religion, and ethnicity. So I look to Dr. Curtis, like, I don't know how you write 12 books, but and he's not old, but writing all these books and making race center to the actual conversation, not just being like, these Black people exist, but explain why that's important, how Blackness is constructed, how it's constructed against other people. And so I think that's something that American Islam studies do well, regardless of what field they're in. But I would say much of the most interesting work on American Islam for me actually happens from people who do not have PhDs in religious studies and don't teach in religious studies fields. And I argue in my contribution that a lot of that has to do with not being bound by that white gaze and that Protestant gaze. So I'm thinking about Saad Abdul Kabir of Muslim Cool, and Sylvia Chan Malik and Zarina Grewal, all of these people who are dealing with questions of activism and race and authority and authenticity, who see themselves in conversation with Islamic studies and American religions, but also draw from Black studies and critical race theory and ethnic studies. And so I think those are models for even those of us within the field that do Islam and race.
Yeah, I'd just like to say I 100% agree with that. We have to look at fields like ethnic studies, critical race theory, American studies. But if we really want to embrace what they're doing, we have to stop with this kind of notion, and here I'm talking about religious studies writ large, of objectivity, right? And that we can be kind of separate from some normative claims. And, you know, I think I've been in discussions about this on Twitter recently as well. I just think that we are scared of doing that, and as a result, we're not kind of taking that step. And I think it's time that we just say that what we're teaching is not apolitical, right? By saying it's apolitical, we're making a political, you know, political stance, and we just have to, you know, own that there's a morality, there's an ethic to what we're doing, just like I think American studies and ethnic studies does really well.
I co-founded a journal called the Journal of Africana Religions, and that was with Sylvester Johnson, and we started publishing in 2013. And I want to make sure that I'm not read in my in offering a Jeremiah that does not have also some sort of, you know, hope, because I mean I'm, you know, all the people that you see before you today we're all working hard to create new stories and different ideas, and I am constantly inspired by the scholars who go to the trouble of not just becoming experts on, you know, on a phenomenon using their native English to understand it, but actually, you know, study Yoruba or Arabic or Fula or, you know, or Portuguese, or they actually learn Spanish or Dutch, you know, for Suriname. And, you know, I mean, and, you know, and are going back either doing ethnographic or doing hard and refusing to, and laying out a new agenda for us, a way that we can, I mean, since nobody's getting jobs anyway, I mean, why rush to the job market? I mean, let's take our time, train well, learn a language other than English. I mean, this is, you know, this is still one of my pet peeves about American religionists. I mean, most of them, frankly, they can't speak or read another language. And I mean, it's just, you know, whew. And I mean, even if you're only going to study the lower 48, I mean, as I say in my piece, but, you know, and I don't want to get back to the Jeremiah, but let me praise the people who are learning Arabic so they can read the Arabic American newspapers, or the people who are, you know, experts in Yiddish and can read Yiddish language newspapers and literature, you know, and So, these kinds of, if we equip ourselves, empower ourselves, and we can do a better job. And and there are many people in our field, and I'm especially inspired, as I say, by the people publishing in Africana religions, who are doing this and showing us the way forward.
Thank you all for those thoughts. I just wanted to add a couple points linking different comments in the past several minutes. Regarding the kind of analysis of the connection between race and religion and ethnicity, I just wanted to kind of emphasize that a bit more and think about the way in which, I think studying U.S. Muslims I am, to some extent, that is what I end up focusing on more, but I'm sure this applies to broader context of the Americas. But, that there's such a rich and layered and complex intersection of various layers of marginalizations and exclusions and dynamics of power and hegemony and oppression that, really, I think the really critical work that, is either informed by critical understandings of the state and the nation state, or white supremacy and race and ethnic studies, and other things, they really bring a kind of perspective to understanding modes of power and subject formation and resistance, etc. That is, really inspiring work. And that's been, in the last 10 years or, and more. The stuff that's been produced in the study of, Islam and Muslims in the Americas has been, really just in terms of thinking politically. And it's just really powerful stuff and exciting stuff, to go back to Atia's Professor Hussein's question. And, I just wanted to connect that also to in terms of, so that's where, one area that I think has really been developing in very exciting and rich ways that I can't even keep up with. Like the number of impressive monographs and articles that I'm just like, okay, my reading list is growing and I feel impoverished that I can't keep up with it. But, another area, I would say, going back in some ways to our conversation of not being circumscribed by the nation state as our primary kind of location of analysis. One thing that was making me think of is how, in the anthropological study of Islam and Muslims, for instance, the study of, the subject in the context of late capitalism and neoliberalism has been a really exciting area of development, thinking about practices of consumption and how they are tied in with religious formations and neoliberal subjectivity in the kind of policies and realities that have taken over in the last half century. And that's something that I've seen a bit developing in the study of Islam in the US, Islam in the Americas. But I think there, I'd love to hear what others think, but I think there's still a lot of room for thinking more about that. What kind of understanding of the individual and the constraints of communal life and the pressures and anxieties that this has produced. That's something that I feel like is promising and developing, but I would, I'm like looking for more and really excited about that. So that's kind of another layer of analysis that I think is something to look for.
Thanks, everyone. We have a couple of questions here that I think are linked thematically, and they move maybe from interventions in the field to more practical concerns. One of them is, how will the field move ahead confronting its white supremacist and colonialist roots when public universities are under direct attack for their use of trainings on implicit bias, microaggressions? And I think a related question that maybe gets more to the teaching element of this. We have the institutional, now we have pedagogical. How can we introduce the complexity of Islam and challenge the concept of American nation state to undergraduates who are increasingly informed by white Christian nationalism? In the context here would be, say, in a 100 level course on American religion.
Well, I guess I'll answer the first part. And this is a very privileged thing to say, but I think it's also necessary. I think we have to be willing to take risks. I understand the executive order is in place. This is a white supremacist country. He's not the first white supremacist we've ever had. The other 44 have been that too, maybe not all as bold. If a white supremacist tells you to stop talking about white supremacy, that should challenge you to talk about it even more, even if it costs you to risk your job. We are living on stolen land that was primarily built by stolen people. So we have a moral obligation to talk about that. And I'm saying that as a person who is married to someone who makes more money than me, so I can afford to lose my job. But we have to be willing to do that, to put our lives and livelihoods on the line, to actually fight for justice. And talking about racism, talking about slavery, it wasn't a whole bunch of people who volunteered to come work on the land for free so they can be Christian. That's the bare minimum that we can do as professors. So I think it's something that we all should be doing regardless of what we're teaching. And I think if you want to talk about white supremacy and the relationship to Islam, start with who some of the original Muslims in this country were and why their religious practices did not survive as much as they did in other parts of the globe, like Brazil and the Caribbean. So talk about enslaved African Muslims. They made up a small portion of the total enslaved population in the United States, but we have written documentation of them. We can see how those practices survived or were transformed in the Gullah Geechee area. So start there, talk about how the United States is inherently an Islamophobic country and that Islamophobia is linked with anti-Black racism.
Yeah, I'd just like to add on to that is we're out here taking risks every day in our classrooms. And I know that there are white scholars like Sarah Mosliner who asked that question, also taking risks, but we need more white scholars to take those risks and to put themselves in the front lines in many ways. You know, I've gotten death threats and rape threats for talking about white supremacy, right? And I know many of my white colleagues and non-white colleagues have as well, but it's still not, I don't think it's enough, right? And I think if you want to start making those interventions, they have to be really kind of bold. And you can't just start with, talking about Native Americans or enslaved Black Muslims. You have to pull that through your entire course, right? And this is where we get back to that kind of that ethic, right? I think teaching about the Black Lives Matter movement, you're teaching about American religion in some way, right? If you're teaching the Land Back movement, you're teaching about American religion in some way. And it's a risk, right? Because you show your cards by including that kind of stuff in your syllabi. But I think it's a necessary intervention, and we have to stop being afraid of showing our cards, of being called political, or in my case, radical. I'm not that radical, but And I think actually we don't give white students enough credit to take this stuff. I'm teaching White Supremacy in Me this semester by Layla Saad, and they're really taking to it quite well and doing some really interesting introspection as I'm reading their reflections. So I think if we take that risk, it'll pay off in terms of making everything better, right? Why are we doing this? Are we doing this so we can talk about some Shaker community that, doesn't have sex? Or are we doing this to actually make a positive impact in the world with our students so that maybe they'll be a little less racist, a little less Islamophobic, right? What are you doing? And so when you answer that question, then I think it's easier to maybe take some of those risks.
I appreciate that the risks that are involved, and I respect those who can't or won't take these risks. But criticisms, the kinds of criticisms of the critical race theory, they They don't change what I do. And, you know, I think let me put it this way, as someone in Africana studies, if Black American knowledge depended on secure tenured positions in universities, there would be no Black, you know, excellence. I mean, think about the sacrifices that people of African descent have made in this country to produce knowledge. I'll just give you even one who, this is not this is an ongoing problem, but one of my favorites is just as a story of yeah, we all have to make money. We've got to put food on the table. Agreed. You know what Arthur Huff Fawcett did? He was one of the greatest scholars of American religions in the 20th century. He taught high school. He taught high school. He had a PhD, you know, from Pennsylvania, UPenn, and he taught and he still published and did really important work. So if you're a true believer in the idea that scholar activism has a chance to change the world, you might, I mean, you might be delivering Amazon stuff, but if you can just, you know, you have an hour to write a day, 2 hours, or to do your activism. I mean, I'm so addicted to this stuff that I'm not sure that, I mean, if they fired me tomorrow, I'd probably still do some of it as long as I had the time to do it. And so, I mean, and so it's become a, you know, a habit. So so I would just say, you know, that we can't, I understand, again, I'm just talking for myself really here, but I also want to say that we have to be careful about, of not thinking of those who have sacrificed before us so that we could be saying these words, you know, and I'm standing on their shoulders and they inspire me, and I can't get rid of the ancestors. They're too much inside of me, and I think about them and what they're telling me to do, even when it's scary, even when I get the threats.
For the sake of time, I'll just say amen to what they said. I don't think I have anything all that important to add.
Great. Well, we are unfortunately at time. Thanks to all of our panelists for this rich discussion. Thank you to our audience members for showing up and for your questions that were submitted. I'm sorry if we did not get to all of them, but we will have record of them and so forth. The other thing I would say is that you can read a version of this, sort of longer and sort of more polished essays along these lines in the new issue of American Religion, Volume 2, Number 1, which should be out in a few weeks. We're putting the finishing touches on it, so I encourage people to read that, to teach it, whatever it is that, however it is that you think you can use it most effectively. Again, thank you to Dr. Curtis, Dr. Gandhi, Dr. Wheeler, and Dr. Adami for your contributions, and we appreciate it.
And thank you so much to all our attendees. It's really wonderful to see everyone here. There will be a recording of this posted, but it takes a minute to get processed. So it may be up either by the end of this week or early next week, and that'll be on the Center for Religion and the Human website, but we'll also link it from American Religion's social media presence, so you can find us there. Thank you again to all of our panelists, and thank you to our attendees.
Thank you all. It was a great
Thank you.
conversation.